To welcome Professor John Walton, who's Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, who's got a wonderful book, which I'm sure is on the bookstall, called The Lost World of Genesis 1. I do recommend that. It is an excellent book, and I gather that Genesis 2 and 3 are coming up soon, if we wait a little bit longer. So Professor Walton has just got back from Israel. He's been on a dig, literally, for the past 4 weeks. So if he's stooping a little bit, like that, you'll know the reason why. He's just been carefully scraping away at things, and I hope he'll tell us something about his discoveries. And so I'll hand over straight to John now, and he's going to be telling us about interpreting how we should interpret the creation narratives in Genesis 1 to 3. Thank you, John.
Thank you. So let me formally and cordially welcome you to the humanities. Yes, in general, and more specifically to the study of religion, which we've heard is evil, to the study of God, who, by the, he's the enemy in Golden Compass, to the study of theology, which is fictitious, and to the study of Genesis, which is antiquarian. At any rate, we'll try to resolve some of those sorts of things as we talk today, because I don't think any of those things, and of course most of you do not either. This lecture is really directed toward helping us understand better those who take a Christian faith seriously, who read the Bible seriously, or who want to do so, and trying to understand Genesis, the first couple of chapters, in relationship to the world of science or scientism or what have you. If you happen to be in that category, this may give you some additional ways of thinking that you were totally unaware of before. If you are not in that category, then it may help you to understand those of us who are in that category, and perhaps reconfigure some thinking about what Christians who take the Bible seriously believe, or at least what are some of the parameters of things. So that's really what we're shooting for today, to try to understand all of that better. Again, whether you're on the inside of that group or on the outside of that group. So I want to talk about reading Genesis 1, and actually Genesis 1, 2, and 3, with ancient eyes. That doesn't mean ones that need bifocals. It means ones that are attuned to the ancient world and to how people thought in the ancient world. Because after all, the Bible is an ancient document. It is not a modern document. And so we have to start by talking just a little bit. I'm not going to do a lot of the theology and hermeneutics here, but a little bit about how we think about the Bible when we come at it from this perspective. One of the terms that's often used is the term authority. It's one that I kind of like, but of course authority can be a tricky term, and so we have to talk a little bit about it. First of all, we come at the Bible as having authority, those of us who are in that camp, with our hermeneutic, our way of reading. The purpose of hermeneutics is not to restrict the text, but to constrain us. That is, so if we believe the Bible has authority, then we're not in a position to dictate to it or make it say what we want it to say. And hermeneutics is designed to help us do that. As in science, we rely on external verification and peer review. Even though we've moved to the humanities, there are some aspects of the sciences that carry over. And so the ideas of external verification and peer review are important in biblical interpretation as well. If I offer an interpretation, I want to be able to give evidence that interpretation is viable. I want others to be able to do the same work and come to the same conclusions. I want my peer community to be able to review my interpretation and be able to affirm it. So in that sense, some of the same aspects we have with the sciences. We believe that God's purpose is carried out through human purpose. That is, the idea of knowing the mind of God could seem like a slippery thing. And so those who are within this Christian community of faith believe that the God has purposes to communicate, and that he carried those out through human beings, and therefore if we want to understand what God was saying, we have to understand what the human authors were saying. Okay, because that's the way we believe that he chose to do it. That's what that biblical belief involves. In that sense, the authority of God is vested in the human author. And our focus is the human author, to try to understand them. That's an important step because that's telling us why it's important for us to read the text in its context, in its time, in its culture, and of course in its language. The Bible, therefore, we would say, may be considered to be for us. That's what Christians believe. The Bible is for everyone, for all believers. The Bible is for us, but it is not to us. It was not written in our languages. It was not written in our culture. And communication, as we know, involves language and culture. And therefore, for us to get to that message that is for us, we have to penetrate the literature and the culture of those to whom it was written. That's why you need translators in whatever your native language is. Someone has probably translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic into that language. And that translation is essential, otherwise you wouldn't be able to read it. Likewise, however, it's important to translate the culture. Language is not all that needs to be translated. Culture needs to be translated. And so in that sense, and we just really ran into an example of that, talking about science and the terms in German and the terms in other languages. That's more than just language translation. That's culture that's involved there. And so we need cultural understanding beyond the language. So the message transcends culture, but the form itself is culture bound. So that's what we're working with authority. We must take our place then in that author's audience. If we're going to understand the biblical text as we ought to understand it, to touch base with the author, we don't have to get inside his mind. Okay? We don't have to psychoanalyze. We don't have to cross-examine. We don't have to figure out what he thought about his mother. Okay? We don't have to get inside his mind. We just need to get inside the circle of communication. Okay? Now, there's some steps in doing that. Okay? But that's what's involved. We believe that the author is communicating effectively to his audience, and therefore we have to join that audience. So, communication. We assume the integrity of communication between the author and his audience. That is, he was saying something meaningful, something sensible. His audience understood it. He knew what he was saying. It wasn't mystical kind of blah blah that no one understood. He knew what he was communicating, and he was communicating effectively. His audience could understand it. We are not that original audience, but we have to try to join it so that we can be parties to the communication on the receiving end. Now, for understanding that, we have to understand a couple categories. First of all, there's a high context category. High context is where the speaker and the audience have much in common, so the communication can assume a lot of common knowledge. Okay? Many of you are in a high context for those lectures this morning. I am not. Okay? My physics is really, really limited. Okay? So many of you were in a high context situation. You understood all of that. But others of you perhaps were in my quandary and struggling along. Okay, that's high context. High context can happen at upper levels of education, where you can assume a lot of knowledge, a lot of terminology in your audience, and you don't have to explain those things. They know. Okay, you try to go and explain the same things to sixth graders, well, that's a little more problematic. Okay, that would be what we call low context. In low context, the speaker and the audience have little common ground, so much has to be explained. Okay, that's called low context communication. Okay, so when my kids try to describe to me about social networking or texting, we're in a low context situation here. Okay, so there's those kinds of issues. Now, what's happening then is that in the communication from the biblical author to his audience, that was a high context communication taking place. They shared culture, they shared language, they shared experiences, they shared a lot of common beliefs. That was high context. We come into that as a low context audience, okay, because their language and culture are not really familiar to us, and we've not shared those experiences. So we are a low context audience trying to enter a high context communication. All right, that's going to make a difference. We can't just blunder into the Bible and think that it's going to be our culture, our context, and then we can read it as high context readers. Okay? We have to understand that we come in as low context readers and make the jump. So this is part of the challenge that we have in reading Scripture well. That means we must see the world the way the text sees the world. Okay? And by the text, of course, I mean in the communication of the text. We have to be able to think of the world the way that we do. We can't assume that they think of the world the same way that we do. Let me give you an example. We look at the moon in the sky, and a lot of ideas come into our mind. It's a rock. It's in orbit. It's rotating, revolving. It's reflecting the light of the sun. Okay? It's X number of miles away. Okay? We have all of those things that are part of our cognition about what it is that we are looking at. Ancient world. Not a one of those things would be true. They do not have that concept of the moon. Not any of them. Not any of those points. Well, you might ask, how did they think about the moon? Now, there's the good question. And the kinds of questions we have to ask. We can't go in assuming the idea of a moon when they talk about the moon, the one we have. So what was their picture of the moon? Light. And if they weren't syncretistic, if they were syncretistic, God. Okay, God's associated with the moon. But if they weren't syncretistic, light. And in fact, Genesis 1 calls them lights. If you ask what was their material view of the moon, they don't have one. It's a light. We have to think about the world the way they did. We're going to read the text the way they heard it. So, whose cosmic geography counts? Okay, ours? No, there's none of that they believed. This is more like what they would have believed. And I won't take the time to go through all of that to explain them all. Here's a Egyptian view. Notice the difference. The Egyptian view is populated. Populated with the gods. For the Egyptians, this is reality. This is the way they would have painted it, by the way. That's from an Egyptian wall painting. This is a more modern reproduction of that same picture, done by my son. Anyway. But they would not have thought of the cosmos in material terms. That wasn't important at all to them. This is what's important. This is the deepest reality that they have. You know, we use the word mythology to talk about something that's fictional, make-believe, fairy tale kind of things. But the mythology of the ancient world is the deepest reality that they have. The truest things that they know are in their mythology. It was their way of conveying deep truth. We have to understand that about them. So when they portray something mythologically, they're portraying their truth. And so they think of the world as peopled, the cosmos as peopled by the gods. And they didn't think this was material. They didn't believe, for instance, that if they picked up a rock, they could hit this guy in the shins over here. You know, it's not the material world. This is truer than the material world. So, now when you get to the Israelites, of course, they don't have this peopled world with all the gods. There was one god had moved outside, wasn't in the neighborhood anymore, was outside, and so they have something more like this. So again, you don't see any gods there, but God's temple up in heaven there at the top. But still, the picture of the cosmos is the same. That is, just on the previous picture, the blue lady there, she's the dome over the heavens. Okay, and she's holding back the waters, the cosmic waters, separated by the air god here, the earth god down there. It's the same picture of the cosmos here. It's just that they're not gods in the picture. But it's still not so much a material cosmos. We'll get to that more in a minute. So we have to think about the world the way they thought about the world. They've got a flat earth. They've got one continent. They've got a solid sky holding back waters above. When Genesis talks about there being waters above and waters below, well, everybody in the ancient world believed that. That's not kind of a scientific revolution and revelation. Everybody believed there were waters above. After all, water came down. If it comes down, it's got to be up there. And it doesn't come down all the time. It doesn't come down all the time. Okay, so something must be holding it up. I mean, they're just working through this process. Anyway, so we also must see the text the way the ancient Israelites saw the text. We're not free to just read the text according to our own inclinations, or even according to our own faith insights. We have to read the text the way they read the text. That is, again, Christians who are interested in taking the Bible seriously attach authority to it. If you're just reading the Bible the way you want to, then the authority is yours. If you expect the Bible to have independent authority, you have to read it according to something outside yourself. And that goes back to the author, because God vested the author with that authority. So we have to try to read the text the way they saw it. Now that means that we can't just read modern science into the text. They weren't thinking that. Again, back to the moon. They weren't thinking all of those things. Cosmic geography. They weren't thinking about cosmic geography the way we do. We can't impose our science on a text, because we have to read it the way the ancient Israelites saw it. If we say, well, but we believe that science is true, and if the Bible's true, then the truth of science should be read back. Wait a minute. Hold it. Okay? We can't impose a truth on it through the way we see it and make it say what we want it to. Then it has no authority. You've given it your own authority. Then you've made science an authority. Okay, so we have to read the text the way they saw it. I'm making the case that we have to read the text as an ancient text. Okay? And that we can't impose our modern thoughts on it. The terminology I use is cognitive environment. That is, there is a certain cognitive environment in the ancient world. And it has all kinds of facets to it. We have our own cognitive environment, whether it's a Western cognitive environment or simply a modern cognitive environment. It's built of all sorts of things from the past, all sorts of literature, all sorts of history, all sorts of experiences that form our cognitive environment. Our cognitive environment in the West is informed by people that we never read. Machiavelli, Descartes, Bacon, Augustine, Aquinas, all of those have impacted our cognitive environment, whether we've read them or not, and whether we know it or not. All the way back to Aristotle, of course. So our cognitive environment is something that's taking shape all the time, but which is a standard in our culture. And it's the same in the ancient world. So we have to try to understand their cognitive environment, because Israel is part of that cognitive environment. And so we can't just incorporate our own or impose our own. We have to read theirs. That means that we have to read ancient literature, because literature is a window to cognitive environment. And that's why I've spent my life reading ancient Near Eastern literature, to try to understand that cognitive environment as best I can. Now, when we get to the issue of science in the Bible, I'm just going to say one or two quick things on this just to give us orientation. First of all, I'm going to contend, and I do contend strongly, there is no scientific revelation in the Bible. Okay? That is, God was not giving Israel any new ideas about science, narrowly defined. Okay? He's not telling them something about the material world that they hadn't known before. Okay? There's no new scientific revelation. Everything that he talks about, that the Bible talks about to Israel, is stuff that everybody else in the ancient world would have believed, and that the Israelites would have believed before Moses ever came along. Okay? It's not new stuff. He doesn't tell them, oh, by the way, the world is a sphere. He doesn't tell them about the hydraulic cycle. He doesn't tell them anything about the meteorology or cosmic geography or anatomy and physiology. Nothing new. Everything in the Bible about those material science things would have been understood by everybody else in the ancient world. That means that we have an ancient old world science at play in the text, and we can't make it something different from what it is. It is an old world science. I'll get back to that one in a minute. Example, just one quick one. Okay? In the Bible, they talk about thinking with the heart. Okay? That's not a metaphor. We use it as a metaphor, but for them it's not a metaphor. They believed that. All the ancient world believed that. All cognitive processes took place down here. Kidney, liver, intestines, stomach. I think with my stomach sometimes. Heart. That's where those things happened. And they all believed that. Look at what the Egyptians did with mummies. Look at what the Assyrians did with the ecstasy. You can see this in everything that they do. It's in the language of all those cultures. God didn't say, okay, hold it right there. You don't think with your intestines. Okay? There's stuff up here. No, God doesn't do that. When he talks about them thinking or loving or any of those emotive, cognitive things, he talks about the heart or the intestines. You've got the verse, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. Intestines is the word. Okay? It's not a word for mind. Translators have been trying to help you. Anyway, there is no scientific revelation. God uses the world that they know because he's not revealing to them science. It's important. He's not revealing to them science, and therefore we don't expect to find scientific revelation there. We expect to find their science there. Observation of natural cause and effect does not remove God from the picture. Psalm 139:13, okay, you knit me together in my mother's womb, says the psalmist. Okay? There it puts God in the process of embryonic development. That doesn't then therefore rule out embryology today. Because no matter what embryologists discover, we would just say, well, that tells us more about how God knit us together in our mother's womb. Okay, so the two are not mutually exclusive. Okay, and this is not, it came out in the questions last time, this is not a way to prove that God is involved. It's an answer to those who say that if you've got a scientific explanation, God is not involved. Okay, this is the argument to say, no, God can still be involved in doing whatever science says happened. That's fine. It's fine. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so to Genesis 1. Why didn't God call the light light? Genesis 1 verse 5 says, and God called the light day, and the evening he called night, and there was morning and evening, day one. So why didn't God call light, light? He called the light day. So what's up with that? Well, it tells you really that light is not what's being created. Day and night is being created. Because that's what he named. And naming is part of a creative act. Separating is a significant creative act in the ancient world. And this separates day and night. It's not, what God is calling light is not particle/wave. Remember, Israel, they don't think of light as material. Lots of your physicists, we even have trouble thinking about light as material. They certainly did not think about light as material. So this is not God manufacturing something material. We have to think like an Israelite. It's a period of light that God called day. That's just metonymy. Okay? It's a period of light that God called day. It's a period of darkness he called night. Okay? That's verse 5. Move back to verse 4. God separated the light from the darkness. Again, we're not talking about material separation here. God separated the period of light from the period of darkness. That makes sense. Back to verse 3. God said, let there be light. Well, no. God said, let there be a period of light. And God separated the period of light from the period of darkness. Remember, there was darkness, verse 2. God said, let there be a period of light in this darkness. God distinguished a period of light from a period of darkness, and the period of light he called day, and the period of darkness he called night, and there was evening and morning, day one. Conclusion we must draw from that. On day one, God created the basis of time. There's nothing material going on here. Not in the Israelite mind. Nothing material going on. He's creating day and night. God created time. Interesting then, right from the get-go, we're talking about creation not of material, but of functions. The earlier question that came up this morning about, well, isn't time just our reflections on it? Isn't that just our perspective? Well, in this account, that's just fine. Time is something for human beings. By human beings, designed by God for human beings, semantics. His first step to bring order to the cosmos. Because order is the issue. Now, we've got this verb create. Verse 1, in the beginning God created heavens and earth, the cosmos. Well, we better explore that and find out what it means. After all, to create doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in our language as create would mean in another language or another cognitive environment. Okay, even in English, we talk about create in a variety of ways. You could talk about creating a masterpiece. You could talk about creating a committee, creating a curriculum, creating havoc. Interesting, the variety of ways that we can use the word create. Well, how about in Hebrew? How's the word, see, great question. See, that's what we have to ask. I'm not interested in the English word create. I'm interested in the Hebrew verb bara. Because that's going to tell me what's going on here. Now, we don't have to necessarily start with the conclusion that to create something in an ancient context would have the same associations and meanings and ideas as creating is used to mean in our science discussions or theology discussions. We have to see how it's used in the text. Well, there are about 50 occurrences. This is how we tell what things mean. We don't have an ancient dictionary from Moses. Okay, we have to look at how words are used. We've already talked about how words can change meaning. Well, we have to look at how words are used to understand their meaning. It takes God as the subject all the time. It's a divine activity. It takes a wide variety of objects. The objects are important here, the direct objects, because they're going to tell you what kind of activity it is, because they'll tell you what the outcome is. Okay, so look at the direct objects. People groups, Jerusalem, this is just a quick list. I have a full discussion in my book. Okay? These are not material things. Bara does not have a direct object that is essentially material. Yet it's legitimate, the correct verb to use. What does that tell us about its meaning? It tells us that it is not necessarily a material activity, not essentially a material activity. Oh, that changes a lot. We get to verse 2. Verse 1 told us God created the heavens and earth, the cosmos. Okay, I take that, by the way, as a literary introduction. I'm not alone on that. That's not my original idea, but I agree with it entirely. Verse 1 is a literary introduction to the chapter. So you'd have to read it. In the beginning, God created the cosmos. Let me tell you how he did it. Okay, it's not a separate creative act. It's an introduction literary to the chapter. So the beginning of the narrative actually comes in verse 2. The earth, it tells us, was formless and void. Tohu vavohu, Hebrew. And there was water. It doesn't start with no material. It starts with no functions. That's what tohu vavohu is. Non-productive, non-functional. It's not working. It's non-ordered. So he doesn't start with no material. C is there. As in all the rest of the ancient Near Eastern narratives, by the way. Okay, but it's not a functioning system yet. Starting point is not lacking matter. but it's lacking order. Darkness and sea are elements of chaos. Chaos has a negative and even a personified issue to it, and we don't mean that here. Okay. Here I simply mean non-order. I'll get to that more later. Tohu, lacking worth or purpose, a place where nothing is done. Okay, again, this is just based on a study of the word, Hebrew scriptures. Okay, Egyptian parallel. They have this concept, the non-existent. Now again, we can't take what we would mean by the non-existent. We can rather observe what they include in the non-existent. To them, the desert is non-existent. To them, the cosmic seas are non-existent. To them, they try to make their enemy non-existent, which doesn't mean that they annihilate every man, woman, and child. It means that they drive them into the non-existent territories. Those are the edges of order, whereas Egypt is the center of order. Or Jerusalem, or Babylon, or Rome, or Paris, or Washington, D.C., or whatever, right? We all perceive, we think in our own cognitive environments. Non-existent is reference to that which has not been ordered. We're dealing then with a competing ontology. We say something exists when it's material. Our science is based on that kind of idea, a materialism. And we explore the materialism of the natural world. And to us, existence is material. Therefore, creation, bringing something from non-existent to existent, is material, a material act. In the ancient world, they considered existence to be defined functionally. And to bring something from the non-material to the material, act of creation, to the non-existent to the existent, that act of creation is to give it a function. They have a different ontology. And this is clearly evident in the ancient Near Eastern texts. And it's likewise evident in the Bible. I didn't bring it in from the ancient Near East. I saw it in the Bible first. Proposed thesis then. We've got two issues in dealing with in Genesis 1. First of all, we've got a functional ontology, which is evident throughout the ancient Near East. That is, things exist when they have a function in an ordered system. That is the defining element of existence, having a function and a role in an ordered system. And therefore, to give something a function and a role in an ordered system is the creative act. It's not giving it a material shape that is the creative act. It's giving it a function and a role in an ordered system. And secondly, another factor that we don't easily recognize from our English perspective, from our modern perspective, is the cosmic temple element, which I will also talk about. So those are the 2 points I'm going to cover in Genesis 1 before we move on to Genesis 2 and 3. I've got to keep moving. So, Dilbert, why not? Every project you worked on this year got canceled after the reorganization. A functional negation. You did nothing. It's as if you didn't exist. Functional ontology. Oh, that's not entirely true. For example, I occupied space. Material ontology raises its head. I'd like to see someone who doesn't exist do that. We've got an ontological controversy going on here. A dead person can occupy space. Ooh, but a dead person exists. Really? Does he? The logical superiority of a functional ontology over a material one. I won the argument, but it was a hollow victory. Oh, they're supposed to come on one at a time. Oh well, functional ontology. Okay, I've gone through some of this already. In the ancient functional ontology, existence is defined by having a function, not by having material structure. Okay, that just comes out of reading ancient Near Eastern texts, loads of it. Genesis 1 provides an account of functional origins, not an account of material origins. That's my thesis. That's my proposal. The Genesis 1 never was intended to provide an account of material origins. That is just not the story that it's telling. By the way, theologically, I still believe, as Christians always have, that God is the one who brought about material origins. But we're not talking about everything that God did. We're talking about what story is Genesis 1 telling. It's a literary question. And I contend that they're telling the story which is most important to them about origins, and that is the functional origins. So, it's an account of functional origins. Genesis 1 is about God bringing order, that's functionality, out of disorder, non-order, non-order, non-functionality. It's fruitless to ask then what things, objects, material, God created on any given day, for the text is not concerned about the existence of matter. They didn't care about the material world. We care about it very deeply. Those of you who are scientists, it's your whole life. Okay, but they didn't care. Example, you use your computer. Okay, if I asked you about your computer, tell me about your computer. You would tell me about its memory, its speed, its applications, its all kinds of things about your computer. You would say nothing, I guarantee this. You would say nothing about the soldering on the motherboard. Because you don't care. Yes, yeah, whatever. You wouldn't talk to me about the casing of the monitor. Who cares? Exactly. Now, I'm not saying I don't care about what you folks do, okay? But the point is, the Israelites didn't, and you can understand that in various aspects of your life, okay? So, it's not about building a house. Okay, I've just started using this analogy in the last month or two. Not about building a house, but making a house a home. When we go looking for a new house, okay? Okay, I've got responsibilities. I'm the dad. So I look at the roof, I look at the plumbing, I look at the electricity, I try to make sure that it's a solid structure, all of this, right? So my wife is saying, okay, what room's going to be what? Where, is this going to be a library or is this going to be a dining room? Is this going to be this or that? Or how are we going to set things up? My kids say, which room's mine? Okay? Because there's a difference between building a house and building a home. And you can either talk about your house as a house, or you can talk about it as a home. You could talk about its origins as a house, or you could talk about its origins as your home. I contend that Genesis 1 is not the story of the house. It's the story of the home. And it's God's home into which He has invited us. And He's in fact built it for us. But He's made it a home for us because it's a home where He lives. We'll get more to that. House and home. Different stories. So, functions in creation. We talked about the first one already. Day 1, God created time. Day 2. Day 2 is when we have the sky set up. What's going on there? There's some question here about whether the Hebrew term rakia there, firmament, expanse, what it is. Is it a solid dome? Is it the area between? I'm recently more convinced that it's the air rather than the dome. The Israelites believed there was a dome, but I don't think rakia is that word. I think there's another Hebrew word that does that, and that's going to be, that's actually developed in my more technical book called Genesis 1 as Ancient Cosmology with Eisenbrauns. So that still, if it's air, it's nothing that they would have believed to be material. Even if it's the solid dome, that's nothing that we consider to be material. So again, we don't have a viable material discussion. In day 2, we do have a functional material discussion. It's all about weather. Third day, okay, it doesn't really have any material creation. It's God has the dry land emerge from the waters, and then let the plants sprout and drop seed and sprout again and drop seed and sprout again. We've got functions here, and those functions pertain not just to growing beautiful gardens, as you do wonderfully here in England, but it pertains to food. The function of growing things, for food, sustenance. Genesis 1, day 1 deals with time, day 2 weather, day 3 food. We're talking about the main functions of human existence. I've really got a haul. Genesis 8:22, as long as earth endures. This is right after the flood. As long as earth endures, seed time and harvest. Ooh, that's food. Cold and heat, summer and winter. That's weather. Day and night. That's time. Will never cease. Genesis 1 is very aware of these three functional categories. Cosmos' temple. We read about rest in the temple, and we think it's relaxing. And then we wonder, well, God doesn't need to relax. What's up with that? God doesn't get tired. What's happening? Well, we're showing our modernity. Okay? Ancient world would have understood this immediately and intrinsically. If God's resting, it's a temple. Say, how do you come up with that? Well, because in the ancient world, that's where God's rest. That's the only place God's rest. The temples are built for God's to rest there. And furthermore, resting is not something that's relaxing or leisure-oriented. When it says he rests, it means that he is taking care of all of the non-order, brought order, so that now he can rule over it. Resting is a function of ruling. The American elections, presidential elections, boy, whew. The candidates spend a year and a half stumping the trail. Okay, a lot of chaos, a lot of non-order, a lot of disorder, a lot of everything. And they're doing all of that for what? So they can sleep in the Lincoln bedroom? No. So they can sit in the Oval Office. Okay, and so when all it's done and the guy or the woman who gets elected sits in that office, they are now resting. Not because they're relaxing, but because now all of that is done and they can now get about the business. And that's what resting is about. When God says he's going to give the Israelites rest from their enemies round about, that doesn't mean that he's going to give them Sundays off. It means that he's going to let them live their lives, have some kind of control over their lives instead of being invaded all the time or threatened. Okay? So rest is the main goal of creation. People may be the climax of the 6 days, but rest is the climax of the creation account. Rest says God has entered his temple. And that temple is not, the temple is the cosmos. The 7-day account in Genesis 1 is God preparing a sacred space for himself, a cosmic temple. And they tell you that when they say he rested. Okay, so that's without day 7, you don't have an account. People often talk about the 6 days of creation because, day 7, God didn't do anything there. He just kind of took a break. No! Day 7 is the key. Day 7 is when God takes up his place. When Solomon built his temple, he spent 7 years building the temple, all the material stuff. Right? But when all that material stuff was done, and there it stood, all ready, it wasn't a temple. The temple did not exist. It was ready to become a temple, but it was not a temple. It became a temple in the 7-day inauguration ceremony when the functions were declared and begun, and when God took up his rest in that temple, and that was the creation of the temple. And Genesis 1 is the same kind of account for the cosmos as a whole. The temple is constructed as a microcosmos, that house that had been materially prepared for 13.75 billion years is now ready to become a home. Ancient 2000 BC temple account, temple building and inauguration. Look at this. Psalm 132. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, come to your resting place. You catching it? It's Jerusalem. It's the temple. Holy of holies. You and the ark of your might. For the Lord has chosen Zion, has desired it for his dwelling. This is my resting place forever. Here I will sit enthroned. God's rest. This is enthronement. 7 days. Analysis of the word day suggests it should be a 24-hour period. Unfortunately, many Christians have used that to say, therefore the earth must be young, and all of material creation must have taken place in 7 24-hour days. They're making the mistake, I think, of assuming that the creation account is a material account, which I think there is strong evidence that it's not. So what's happening? Most of it concerns the age of the earth. If the 7 days is like a temple inauguration, the objects are not necessarily being made in those 7 days. The days are concerned with bringing order rather than making things. The 7 days has nothing to do with the age of the earth. Age of the earth is a material question. Genesis 1 is a functional cosmic temple account. So consider, nearly all the modern controversies concern what the biblical view is of the span of time over which things were created. If the text primarily addresses functions, not structures, what's the implication? Non-existent. Genesis 1, the text asserts that in the 7-day initial period, God brought the cosmos into operation by assigning roles and functions. That is the creative act in the ancient world. Genesis 2 and 3. Okay. Oh, I'm going to have to skip some of this. Okay. So, the biblical case, Adam and Eve. Let's talk about it. Again, we have to ask the question, material, functional, what's going on? Okay, what kind of account is Genesis 2 and 3 for the Israelites in their context? Okay, that's our operative question. So we have to find out what it's doing for them. We want to impose questions of human origins, okay? Maybe it is talking about human origins, but in what sense? In what aspect? Is it material? Is it something else? Okay? So that's the question in front of us. Now, our first concern is, what is the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? Genesis 1 has the stuff we just talked about, 7 days. Okay, Genesis 2 has the Adam and Eve stuff. Adam and Eve are not mentioned in Genesis 1. 7 days are not mentioned in Genesis 2. Okay, so what is the interrelationship? Many have assumed, or most traditional assumption, is that you've got the two of them are blended. That Genesis 2 is somehow a discussion of day 6, even though the text doesn't say that. Okay, but that's often the assumption. I believe that the function of the toledot is the introductory phrase in Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heaven and earth. Generations is the word toledot. This is the account of the heavens and earth. That introduces a new literary unit. That's true throughout Genesis. They always use that to introduce a new literary unit. That means that they're not overlapping. It means that they're sequels. Okay? Now, so that means that we're not talking about day 6 in Genesis 2. That means that it's unlikely that the people in Genesis 1 are Adam and Eve. Okay? Again, you maybe could make the case that they are, but that wouldn't be inherent in the question. So the idea that the second account is sequel rather than synoptic would mean that the first account did not necessarily deal with Adam and Eve. The second account doesn't need to fit into day 6. Both accounts are functional rather than material. The first one sets up the cosmos as sacred space to function on behalf of people. That's what the temple is for, cosmic temple. The second chapter sets up particular people in sacred space. All of the Eden terminology is sacred space terminology. So they're being set up in sacred space to function on its behalf. That's the two different things that chapters 1 and 2 are doing. Now, what we'll find is that the discussion of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 is archetypal. Everything in Genesis 2 regarding human origins is first and foremost archetypal. What I mean by that is that the making accounts are most relevant to Adam and Eve as archetypes rather than as individuals. It is not just Adam who is made from dust. It is not just Eve who is made from the side of Adam. Let's talk about it. Psalm 103:14, this is the psalmist talking, for he knows how we are formed, he remembers that we are dust. Notice the psalmist is using we here. How we are formed, and we are dust. That means the psalmist considered himself as formed from dust. Same terminology in Hebrew. The psalmist considers himself as formed from dust. He's not claiming to be Adam. But he's telling us that Everybody is formed from dust. Every human being is formed from dust. And that means that being formed from dust does not preclude being born of a woman. Therefore, when Genesis 2 says that Adam was formed from the dust, it is not a suggestion that he was not born of a woman. Follow the logic? Then what's it saying? It alludes to Genesis 2:7, but also to 3:19. Genesis 3:19 says, "Dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Does that refer just to Adam? Of course not. It refers to every human being, because we're all formed from dust. That's archetypal. It is true of the whole human race. It's not just a distinct statement about the origins of the first human being, material origins of the first human being. Every human is formed from dust. Being formed from dust does not describe material formation. Being born from dust would not preclude being born of a woman formed from dust. The picture I've got here, this is an Egyptian relief. That's Khnum, the creator god, and on the potter's wheel is the pharaoh. He is forming the pharaoh from clay, from the dust. That formation of pharaoh is not his material formation. That is rather forming him to be pharaoh. That is, giving him a role and a function. It's not a suggestion that he wasn't born of a woman. It doesn't pertain to the material origin, but to the role for which he has been made. In Genesis, people are formed for a priestly role, Genesis 2. We get that in 2:15, where it says that the people are put in the garden to avad and shamar, to serve and to keep. Those are not landscaping terms. He's not doing the weeding and the pruning. Those are priestly terms. Throughout the Pentateuch, those are priestly terms. And so they're being put in sacred space, the garden. Every description of the garden pertains to sacred space. Again, that's not my case. It's one I agree with, but that's been long around. Okay? So they're put in the garden to serve a priestly role. Priests are representatives. Again, an archetypal role. In Ephesians 2:10, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Created in Christ Jesus for good works. A function. A role. So, when it talks about Adam being made from the dust, okay, that talks about his mortality. And it's connected to the role that he's being given. Now, Eve is made from Adam's side. It's not the word for a rib. It's not an anatomical reference to a single bone. Okay, it is a reference to his side. Throughout Hebrew scriptures, that word is used to refer to things that come in pairs architecturally. A cabinet. Each side, the two cabinet doors of a whole cabinet. Okay, a single cabinet with two sides. That's a side. We talk about a side of beef. Okay? Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Okay, what side of beef? You go to the restaurant and order ribs. You don't expect just bones. Okay? So, we have to... What? You know, okay. So when it says that God took one of Adam's sides, he only has two. And God took one of his sides. So the picture, just convenient. I didn't Photoshop that. That's how it was found. Anyway, so God took one of his sides. This is not simple surgery. And you say, okay, so we're not talking anatomy physiology here. Of course we're not. Israel's not thinking that way. This is archetypal. How's it archetypal? The text tells you. Adam wakes up, he says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and then the text nails it. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. This gives the absolute unity, the inherent unity It's making an archetypal statement about the nature of man and woman. Furthermore, I would suggest, I don't have it here, that Adam saw this in a dream. God put him in a deep sleep. Go to Abraham in chapter 15. God puts him in a deep sleep so he can be attuned to what's going on in the covenant, the torch passing through the animal halves. That's a vision to give him the basic essence of things. Same kind of word used here. Okay. Archetypes. Whoa. Okay, archetype does not negate the existence of the individual. I still believe Adam and Eve are individuals, historical individuals, but they don't necessarily come right at the front of everything. Again, if we have people en masse created in chapter 1, as is common in ancient Near Eastern texts, and then Adam and Eve coming along with a priestly role, being put in a garden in chapter 2, that could come at a much later time. Okay? Remember that Cain finds a wife somewhere, and Cain's worried about other people going to kill him. So there are lots of options here in the text itself. Okay? So our appropriate question for Genesis 2 is not, is this what really happened? Events. But rather, is this what people really are? Archetypes. Narrative art. The artist gets to choose the conventions. Okay? On the left there, Dora Maar. Most of you probably don't know the name. Dora Maar was one of the models for Picasso's paintings. This is his Dora Maar picture. Now, Picasso used his creative conventions. We can't argue with the conventions he chose. If you want to understand his art, you don't say, what an idiot, why didn't you make it look like that? And you would say, because I'm not a photographer, I'm an artist. Okay? He can choose his own conventions. Okay? You can't reconstruct the photograph from the painting, but that's not its purpose. Okay, we want a Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 that allows us to reconstruct our science, reconstruct the world in our view. Wrong question. Okay, we have to accept the artist's conventions and the portrayal of truth and reality that he wanted to give. Picasso is trying to capture truth and reality. You may or may not appreciate his decision of how to do that, but that's what he's doing. And likewise in Genesis 1 through 3. The literary artist is capturing reality that is most important to him. And we have to appreciate the reality he captures, not make it or try to make it be the one we want. I'll calm down. Okay. So, they're not interested in giving the equivalent of a photo. They're interested in talking about origins as they perceive its importance. So, humankind was created with mortal bodies. You are dust. Dust you shall return. It was given provision by God in the garden. It was given the role of serving in sacred space. It implies relationship. These are the important theological issues being conveyed. Humankind divided into male and female, and so would seek out new family relationship. There are a lot of truths here being conveyed, and they're not dependent on science. Material origins. If Genesis 2 has an archetypal focus, there is no biblical account of material human origins. There is none. It's not of interest. It does not mean that common descent is true, only that it would not contradict the biblical record. Common descent would not contradict the biblical record of material human origins, because there is none. Common descent is our attempt to explain material human origins. The Bible is not trying to explain material human origins. So they can't give contradictory accounts. They're giving different accounts. Okay, certainly there are special things that God does. I believe that endowing with the image of God is not something that can come by evolution. That's my belief. I think that there is a spiritual being. I'm not a strict dualist in any sense, but still the idea that there's something spiritual about us that makes us more than machines, more than just a bunch of cells, that there's something spiritual about us, and that's got to be something that God gives. But all of those are archetypal and functional. The designation as priests, these are things that God is involved in the process. Priestly roles, I won't go into that. It was good, okay. The designation that it was good, I'm going just a bit over time. I hope that's okay. The designation that it was good. Okay, what good can mean a lot of different things in Hebrew as well as in English. So how do we know which meaning it's given here? Well, good we have to get from context. And we're told in Genesis 3, it was not, Genesis 2, it is not good for man to be alone. See, now we find something that's not good, and that can help us figure out what it means for other things to be good. Not good for man to be alone means that it's functional, it's how he works, how his role works out. It's not something that's ethical or moral. It's not something in the perfection of his design. It's a functional designation. So every time it says it was good in Genesis 1, it's saying it was functioning. It was set up to work. It was given its role. Okay? So whatever order God established was good. That doesn't mean that no disorder or non-order remained. There was non-order remaining. The sea remained. Remember, the whole account started with the sea. There was non-order, tohu vavohu. There was non-order. It wasn't evil, it wasn't personified, but there it was. God was bringing order, but the sea didn't cease to exist. Okay, rather, the order was kind of their island of order in the non-order that still surrounded it. The serpent is present. The serpent, at this point, represents only non-order. Once sin enters the world, then he becomes the catalyst for disorder. Okay, so I'm designating three categories. Non-order, when it has just not been worked on yet. Order, when God has brought roles and functions. Disorder, when something is wrong or bad or has been now affected badly. Okay, it's like my basement. Okay, I've got an unfinished basement. There's still all of the boxes around the perimeter. That's the non-order. It's not bad, it's just not dealt with yet. There they are. Lots of my kids' stuff, they've moved out, but their stuff has not. And there it is, all around. I've got a ping pong table and a foosball table. We created an island of order so that we can function playing ping pong and foosball in this non-order. Now, if a raccoon or a possum got into my basement and started ripping up boxes, that would be disorder. Okay? Non-order, order, disorder. Okay? Outside, there is an outside the garden, and it has less order. Order finds its center in sacred space. That's what sacred space is. That's what it creates. God is the center of order. And so God's presence there brings order. That's what creation is. And it brings order, and that order is centered on Him. When people chose to eat the tree, they chose themselves as a center of order. You can be like gods. And when they chose to center order on themselves, okay, they brought disorder. Okay, and they were cast outside the garden where there is less order. Okay, so order is connected to sacred space. Non-order remained after creation. People were given the task of expanding sacred space and order. Subdue and rule. That's what they're supposed to do. Sacred space expanding. The presence of God brought life. The serpent is like a chaos creature in the ancient world, promoting disorder. People wanted to be the center of order. Sin brought disorder. People ejected from sacred space. That's the basic sequence. Okay. We'll have to skip all of these. Maybe some of those will come up in the questions. Okay, yeah. So how should we think? It's not easy to accommodate the scientific consensus, but it's not impossible. Okay? The scientific consensus is interested in material continuity, common descent, right? Lots of times people think that the Bible demands material discontinuity, special creation of Adam and Eve. Okay, again, if material is not the issue, then we don't have the problem. We still have to try to figure out if the science is making sense or not. Acceptance of science, though, does not require rejection of the Bible or faith. And that's part of the point I'm making here. If somebody's already decided that the science is convincing, whether that's common descent, age of the earth, polygenism, whatever aspect it is, if you've already decided that's convincing science, does that mean you have to throw away your faith? Or that people who have faith can't really believe those things? No, it doesn't mean that. Okay? The acceptance of the scientific consensus does not require the rejection of Genesis or of faith or of Bible. If we only have read it as an ancient Near Eastern document, we would not have that conflict. Okay. I would further, just to summarize this, I would further suggest that not only does the Bible not give new scientific revelation, itself it does not have scientific entailments. That is, that you cannot draw scientific conclusions. You can draw theological conclusions about the world. God ruling it, God working in it, the material world is contingent on God. Those are theological entailments. But strictly material, natural world entailments, I would say the Bible has none. So to say, well, so the earth must be young, or so Adam must be this, or Eve must be that, or no, those are scientific entailments. And the Bible is not revealing science, it's not giving new scientific information, and I would say then it does not have scientific entailments. Likewise, the science really cannot establish theological entailments. Not its job. Okay. Sorry I went a little bit over and skipped a lot of material. So.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Well, I'm sure that's again stimulated plenty of questions and discussions. So over to you. So please, front row. Yeah.
I just had a question with the idea that Adam and Eve might not have been the first humans. When they ate the fruit and sin was introduced, does that mean that sin was also introduced to the same time to all the other people that had lived? And where does choice come into that, where they didn't make the choice to eat the fruit and yet they were still given sin?
Good. Okay, now see, with a question like that, they're very important. But there we have to start dealing with speculative models, because the text doesn't address that and science can't address it. And so we can only try to devise models. One model would say that they were representative of all those people, that those people were not yet responsible, accountable for however they were living, because they didn't have wisdom. Adam and Eve ate the tree, brought wisdom to humankind. Now they're all responsible and guilty, and so sin becomes their plight. That's, again, one model. There could be others, but that's all we can do is speculate on models.
So did those people not have free will then? When
they were impacted by Adam and Eve's actions, which is always true in the Bible. The father of the house has actions that impact the whole household. The king has actions that impact the people. And so in that sense, they were impacted by those things, that those who were their chosen, designated representatives for choices they made.
John, just to follow on that, I mean, the Middle East culture, I think then, as now, would be much more of a community culture, wouldn't it? And we're very much used to, kind of those of us in the West anyway, a very individualistic culture. Right. I mean, do you want to reflect on that a little bit in the context
they certainly
of
that? Yeah, corporate solidarity and corporate responsibility are all part of the ancient world. And so that wouldn't have caused them to blink at all. That everyone, I mean, even the high priest in Israel, there are things that the high priest did on behalf of all the people. That was his role as a priest, representative role. And so that's probably the direction we'd go there.
Thank you. Next question, please. Should we go? Yes, Pardon. Yes, John, there's some water for you.
Oh, thanks.
Just explain that in Genesis 1, your vision is more as functional activities, and this there's a traditional view sometimes that the first set of days is kind of building the house, and the second set of filling it with different things. Would you rule out completely the idea that there are some structural things as well intended in Genesis 1? Something of the building as well?
First of all, I do accept what people have said all along, that there's a literary structure to Genesis 1. Day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6. They have a symmetry that makes some sense. I'm just going well beyond that. Lots of people kind of stop there and say, oh, it's just literary. I'm not saying it's just literary or just theological or just figurative or just metaphorical or just analogical, or I'm saying this is a deep reading of the text as an ancient document. Now, could it be both material and functional? Is that part of your question? It certainly could be, but you'd have to prove it. You can't just assume it. That is, I've demonstrated the functionality aspect. You would have to demonstrate the materiality. My point is that it starts with material already in place, that really for the first 5 days, there's nothing material that's brought into being that the Israelites believed is material. Even day 4, sun, moon, and stars, we talked about the moon. They don't think they're material. So for the Israelite mind, they're not talking about the material cosmos. It's their signs, seasons, days, and years. That's what those lights are for. And so, again, at that point, you've got so little that's material going on, it's hard to make that case.
Thank you. Yes, I think you were next, and then afterwards, yes.
I totally agree with you that we have to be a high context reader to understand a religious text. But the question is that, okay, there are two stories, one religious story, one scientific story about the world. If I ask you which of these two are true, you may answer that both of them are true. Okay, but the next question is that which of these two tells us about the fundamental essence of the world? Given an example, take for example water. If I ask a scientist what is water, he would say it is H2O. If I ask from a person who is in a desert and who is thirsty, he says that water is something that removes my thirst. And if I ask another person who is religious and ask what is water, he says I use for ablution. So 3 different accounts. Some of them are functional. But in reality, if you ask, really the essence of water is H2O, not more than that. So the scientists may claim that we are giving you an essential account of the world, and we do not reject those stories, but the fundamental story is this one. Do you agree? Or
I'm not trying to degrade or in some way be negative about what science does and what science discovers. I think that's very important. I'm just trying to make the point that that wasn't what the Israelite in the ancient text was interested in. I think it's very important, and I'm interested in it, though I'm not very good at it. But so yes, I think that is the essential nature of the material aspect of water. But Israelites, and often ourselves, again, I just worked in Israel for 4 weeks on a dig. And boy, you keep your water right here, okay, because you die if you don't drink enough water. You dehydrate very quickly. So, that's much more important to me than that it has to do with hydrogen and oxygen.
yeah, but religious books also tell us about this world, which is material, but in a different way. Or they are talking about something completely different. Which of these accounts are you
No, this world has a material aspect, but I think that there might be some disagreement to say this world is material. It has material aspects, that's what science looks at, but it's more than the material.
So water might have some immaterial aspects.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, question. Yes. Yeah.
I appreciate what you're. Thank you so much for that talk. You're saying that the Genesis 1 story could have material aspects and as well as functional. You've outlined the evidence for the functional. You lost me near the beginning of your talk. I mean, I picked up again, but you lost me where you said, when it says "let there be light," this actually means a period of light, and you just lost me there.
And
Because I would think that, you could argue that is talking about a material aspect.
Again, it's because he names the light day. Okay? If
Right, but
names
he
the
does
light-
that late, that occurs later
Right.
in the text.
Okay, but I started with 5, I moved to 4, I moved to 3. Okay, and 5, because it's 5 where we can most easily see the issue. If he says that he named light day, that means that he's not talking about the light itself, he's talking about the period of light, because that's what day is. Furthermore, in verse 4, when he separated the day and night, he's not separating material things. There is no material thing to night, okay? Light and darkness. There is no material aspect of the darkness. They didn't believe there's a material aspect to light, and you couldn't separate them anyway because one is the absence of the other. And as a result, it must be talking about period of light and period of darkness. So in verse 5 and 4, I tried to establish that sensibility demands that it's a period of light and darkness. And that led me to bring that back to verse 3. That's the logic.
Okay. Yes, Peter. Yes.
How should we understand the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, and can we find it in the Bible?
Good. Ex nihilo, again, pertains to material. I mean, that's what ex nihilo is all about. It's a statement about material from no material. Okay, now, do I believe in ex nihilo creation? Yes, I do. Okay, I've got New Testament passages that can substantiate that, but I've also got basic theology that I think substantiates that. So I believe in ex nihilo material creation. But I do not believe that that's the story that Genesis is telling, and I don't believe that Genesis is talking about that. And bara, certainly, the word create, certainly does not mean that, because there's other places where there is clearly material already there. So, theologically, yes. New Testament, yes. Genesis, no.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I noticed in the Genesis text you mentioned bara. I also noticed you didn't mention asa. Is there a reason why?
Just because it's more complicated. Asa is, for those of you who don't know Hebrew, asa is the verb that's usually translated either to do or to make. And it occurs throughout the Genesis 1 narrative. God made the animals, God made the heavenly bodies, okay? So it's used throughout. So that also bears examination. I've got that full discussion in the larger monograph, Genesis 1, top corner there, Genesis 1 is ancient cosmology. I believe that it really should there be translated do, not make. That is, that God did them. And how did he do them? He did them by creating them, by giving them functions. And that's exactly what the end of Genesis 1 says.
But is there a reason why the writer chose to use two totally different words?
Sure. I think they do have different quality, and therefore I think that he chose them for that purpose. I think bara has more specifically to do with a separating act of giving a distinct function. And that's a different thing from what asa means.
Please, over here, please.
Taking into consideration that you're dealing with the ancient perspective, how do people see God in everything, can you infer that Genesis 1 is also a kind of metaphor that God is teaching the way that the universe is ruled by him instead of God, in nature there's a separation?
I wouldn't call it a metaphor. I think that is the theological message, at least it's one of them. Some people talk about Genesis 1 as polemic against the ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. It can serve a polemical function, but I don't think it was written intentionally as a polemic. My reason for that is because usually when you write a polemic, you reference the thing you're arguing about and the points that they make. And the Bible ignores them. It doesn't reference them. So I don't think it's intended as a polemic, but certainly it's making points that would differentiate Israelite belief from the rest of the ancient world.
Just to follow up on that, so one thing I did think you touched on was the fact of the sun and the moon being Babylonian gods, essentially, and talking about them as lights to avoid any connotation that they might be used as gods. So could you comment on that in that context of that question?
I mean, that's a fairly common explanation, that when Genesis 1 calls them lights, the author is avoiding using the terms Shemesh and Yareach, because Shemesh and Yareach were names of the sun and moon deities in the ancient world. I don't take that as polemical, because the Bible doesn't hesitate to call them Shemesh and Yareach in other places. They didn't see that as a polemical point that, ooh, we can't use Shemesh because that'll make, So I think that they referred to them as lights rather than Shemesh and Yareach because of the functional element. That is what they truly are, lights. And therefore, that's what the text is emphasizing. So I don't take that as polemical, I take that as functional. But it has an kind of an inbred, at least slight polemical aspect to it.
Thank you. Somebody else had a hand up and I've lost it now. But okay.
Oh.
How much of the Israelite cosmology is affected by the Near Eastern cultures? Because I once saw an exhibition in British Museum which implied that the notion of 7 days is actually derived from Babylonian culture.
And no, it's not. The 7-day week does not occur anywhere else in the ancient world. The information that they're drawing that from in Babylonian texts is quite vague and has been largely rejected by ancient Near Eastern scholars. So that really is not a viable way to go. The question about borrowing is one that you see often. When you read about people analyzing Genesis in relation to ancient Near Eastern accounts, they'll talk about Genesis borrowing the Babylonian account or the Egyptian account. And I must confess that I'm not at all persuaded of that. Borrowing is a tough thing to prove. Any of you who are professors and you try to prove that a student plagiarized and right, it's a difficult task. And you've got to have a lot of information to demonstrate that. And I do not believe we have anything close to that for Genesis 1. Certainly, though, Genesis 1 is part of the cognitive environment of the ancient world. That means they're not thinking about the world the way that we do. They're thinking about the world the way that anybody in the ancient world thought about it. And so that cognitive environment is represented in Genesis. They're thinking about a dome. They didn't have to borrow that idea. That's how they thought about the world. It's not a borrowed idea. It's inherent in what they believe about cosmic geography. And so the idea of a functional ontology, they didn't have to borrow that from anybody. It's just how they thought in the ancient world. It's in the air, it's in the water, that's how they think. And so to that extent, I don't think we have to go to the issue of borrowing from a specific piece of literature or a couple of pieces of literature. There's not enough evidence for that. Okay, but we can think very deeply about the way that Israelite cosmology reflects ancient cognitive environment. And that's the direction that I'm going. You can find out more about that one in this book, The Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament, where I go through many of these different areas of thinking and talk about how Israel is reflecting thinking in the ancient world without really borrowing specifically from pieces of literature.
Can I just follow up on the question on the week? So is it the case that really the idea of a week, the idea of a day of rest, really, I mean, the first time it occurs in ancient literature is actually in these Hebrew texts. Is
The
that
only
is
place.
that correct? It's
That's
the only
right.
place, yeah.
Now, they don't have 7-day weeks in the ancient world. They don't have a 7th day of rest. They don't have those concepts. Now, maybe we could say maybe they're there and we just haven't found them yet. But at this point, we've got hundreds of thousands of texts, and it hasn't popped up its head yet.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes.
Last question.
Yes.
So, taking into consideration again the functionality, you mentioned that. Let me organize the question. The world had been created, sun, glass, nature, every aspect. But the account of Genesis talks about organization, the way that to the men. But God had already created the sun, the light, everything. So, but the Bible does not take into consideration this creation, human beings or other animals. But now organization in order to the human being have it and take over and exist the priest function.
Remember, exactly, a great question. Remember, I'm suggesting that Genesis 1 is functioning as making the house a home. Okay? So the house existed, it could have functioned as a house. The roof was there, it kept out, think about the house. Roof is there, it kept out rain, the electricity worked, but now it's becoming a home. It's becoming a home for God's cosmic temple. It's been prepared for this, and now it's going to become that sacred space, the home of God, in which people are invited to come in and be in relationship with Him, be tenants. Okay? That's what this part's about. So yes, all of the material cosmos was functioning scientifically for all of that time, but now the text is not talking about its scientific functions. The text is talking about its functions as a place for people. Signs, seasons, days, and years, that's for people. That's not inherent in just material function, material working. Okay? That's for people. So it's now creating a place for people to function for them as sacred space in which God has dwelt. That's the new part. The new part is nothing material. Nothing material is the new part.
So we were talking about a new order, a new way of God is inviting them to get a relationship with Him.
Right? And again, you drive by the house before you bought it. It's just a house. but now you're moving in and it's your home, and this is how all these things are going to function for you in your home. Okay? It's making the house the home.
Yes, please.
And John, how important is, for example, to read those chapters with New Testament eyes, for example?
Well, I think we shouldn't ignore New Testament. I'm a canonical guy, so we can't ignore New Testament, but likewise, we shouldn't expect that the New Testament is trying to reflect an ancient Near Eastern point of view. By the time you get to New Testament, we've gone through Hellenism. Aristotle and Plato are on the ground and working there. You've got all kinds of other factors that have come into play. And so you may get some perspectives from New Testament that represent New Testament times, and that's important to get too, but we shouldn't think that we can take Paul and think that he's operating like an ancient Near Eastern guy. He is not. He's a Hellenistic Jew.
That sounds like another talk. Yes, please. Yeah.
Genesis 2:15 is often used as a starting point for an environmental ethic. Is that a fair reading given your discussion today?
I think that comes into play. The environmental ethics should come out of the larger picture that this is God's place. This is sacred space, and we've been put in it as stewards, and all of that should come from it. Some also use the subdue and rule, okay, and that's from Genesis 1, and that the subdue and rule is part of the environmental aspect. That's more questionable because the subdue and rule was pre-fall, and the idea that they were supposed to be expanding sacred space isn't quite as possible once they're not in sacred space. And so that becomes a more questionable issue. But regardless of that, I think the fact that Genesis recognizes this cosmos as God's sacred space gives us a responsibility and a stewardship that can be played into the creation care.
Wow, that triggered off a lot more questions than we got time. Right at the back, and then we'll come forward. Yeah, thank you. So, yes.
Not a question. This is not a question, but I wanted to point out a striking similarity. You said that for he knows how we are formed, he remembers that we are dust. So we are all made of dust. Hindu philosophy believes that all living creatures are made up of 5 spirits. And those 5 spirits are land, water, light, air, and space.
Interesting. Remember, we're made from dust, but the biblical view is also that we are endowed with the image of God. And that's the contrasting picture.
Well, I think the last question was just a moment. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Your reading of Genesis is not inconsistent with consensus science, or need not be inconsistent. In the States where you're from, there is huge controversy, and it's largely, if it's fair to say it, the evangelical community is more up in arms over this description. Do you have an explanation that might be in terms of the cognitive environment for the evangelicals that would explain this, or do you have a particular understanding of why that community in particular is would tend to be more literal, what we would say in the States, of its interpretation?
Yeah, sure. That's a hallmark of the evangelical approach, to interpret literally. Again, my contention would be you cannot be more literal than by reading it the way that the ancient author intended it. Okay, and so that's the contention I make. I travel in those circles, I speak, I give this lecture all over the country in those kinds of contexts. And, you know, the idea is that somehow they believe the Bible demands certain scientific entailments, whether it's the age of the earth or whether it's, you know, the way of Adam and Eve, and you know, they believe that. And so the task I have becomes to explain that how reading the Bible as an ancient book instead of as a modern scientific thing really lets us read the Bible seriously, very seriously. I'm not skirting it. I'm reading it seriously, but yet see that really doesn't carry scientific entailments with it.
So actually, you're encouraging the people to read Genesis more literalistically.
In one sense, yes.
That's how I understand it. I mean, which is important, I think, because people, bandy that word around as if it has an obvious meaning, but actually.
And that's why I
Yeah,
tend to
so-
talk about taking the text seriously.
Mhm.
We take the text seriously by reading it the way the author intended it and the original audience would have understood it. We can't do a more serious job than that.